So for example, if you're in a very business-focused arena, if you're in like the business world, it's going to be probably a professional, formal interview. Like you wear a suit, they ask you questions, they're predetermined, you answer them. Versus if you're going somewhere that's like a small business or more of like a counseling or academia, it might be a different style of interview. It might be more casual, it might be where they sort of just tell you about their company or they want to get to know you, and they don't ask as many predetermined questions. So as you're applying for jobs or as you're even looking for positions, I would start thinking about that type of thing. So where is it that I'm applying? Who is going to be interviewing me? What should I be prepared for? And obviously you can't prepare for everything. We never know which particular questions people will ask us, but at least being ready for the gist of it, at least having an idea of what you might run into is helpful for preparing. But a lot of companies will tell you just right off the bat, like, we're scheduling this interview with you, it's going to be a panel of 3 people, it will be myself and so and so and so and so. Or if you know you're interviewing for a particular position within a department, you might go and look on their website or look on their LinkedIn, their group LinkedIn page to find out, okay, who works in that department, who's likely to be the person that might interview me, or let me just find out a little bit more about what the department does, like you mentioned, so that at least I have an idea of where someone might be coming from. So yeah, I think a lot of it is honestly just reaching out to the company and getting your information directly there. But if you're not able to, some of that secondary internet research can help as well. Step foot in the building of where you're doing an interview, you're on interview mode. So if you're in the front waiting area, they may be coming to their front desk person and saying, hey, how was that person when they were sitting out there? Were they checking their phone? Were they engaged? Were they talking to someone? Were they rude to you when they checked in? Because a lot of times they'll want to know, okay, how do you act in front of us during the actual question and answer, but how are you just as a person? Like, what do you do when you're just talking to someone and you don't know it's an interview? Who else they're interviewing, so you can't compare yourself against them. But instead, you can just highlight the things that are really great about you, why you're a good fit for this position, why you have the skills that are unique or that make you a good person for this role. And so now you're not focused on the task of comparing to other candidates or other competitors, which can be exhausting. Instead, you're just talking about how great you are. So I think that's a great strategy to sort of bring into any interview, regardless of the beginning situation. Probably depends on like the environment that you're in. So maybe in your situation with government positions, it wasn't something that was the standard. But a lot of times if you're going like to a corporate company or you're interviewing in like an organizational setting, they'll come out to like the front desk, the waiting area, and when they're walking back with you to their office or wherever you're going, they'll say, hey, how did you get here? Did you find us okay? How was traffic? How's the weather? Those kinds of things. So it's not necessarily personal small talk, but a lot of times people go into the interview and they're so focused on like, here's my job, here's what I have to do, here's my experience, they're like, the weather? I don't know how the weather is, I don't know. So being prepared to have that mini conversation and like loosen up a little bit, show them that you not only have the skills again for the job, but you also have that professional ability to communicate in the workplace. Sometimes we forget about, it's really important to have skills, it's really important to be able to articulate them, but it's also really important to be likable. Yes. If you go into an interview and you are the best nurse in the world, but you have a poor attitude, they might hire a nurse who doesn't have as many skills, but really wants to be there, is enthusiastic, and wants to fit in with the culture. Explaining to someone, hey, I know this about you, I found this information, I find it super interesting, let me relate it to what we're talking about, or asking questions and saying, can you tell me more about this, and showing that genuine interest and showing that professional enthusiasm. Keeping in mind that when you go in there, it's not even just about how you answer the questions, it's about how do you make small talk when you're walking from the waiting room to the office. Or, how do you ask those questions at the end of an interview and show them that you're interested in the job and you want to learn more. So showcasing, again, that professional enthusiasm, that you're interested in the position, that you're interested in the company and the culture and the person themselves, it's a great way to get them on board with you as a candidate. One of the things that students of every level at the university come to us and ask us all the time is like, how do I know what questions they're going to ask me? And there's no way for you to know. Like, there's no way for you to know every single and anticipate every single question that they might ask you. So one of the best things that you can do on your end is prepare for every type of question. And one of the ways that we talk about doing that is called story banking. So basically what story banking is just going back in your mind and thinking of stories or examples of things that you've done that might be helpful to demonstrate in an interview. So thinking about your education, thinking about your work experiences, thinking about even things that you've done like class projects or collaborations, volunteer work, anything that you've done that shows a skill that you think is important, review that in your mind and sort of keep it in the back there. So that way there's an infinite number of questions they could ask you, but you have a finite number of experiences. So if you've got them all mixing around in your brain, when they ask you one of those million questions, chances are you've got an experience that can apply to that. And the other half of that story, along with story banking, is that you should be telling stories in an interview. Your answers shouldn't just be one-word answers, they shouldn't just be factual answers. If you were to say, if I said, what's a strength of yours, and you were to say, I'm a great communicator, okay, that's fine, but I don't know you, so I don't know what great communicator means to you. But if you can give me an example to demonstrate it, that's a lot stronger. But one of the biggest questions that you're going to find probably in any field that you go into, behavioral questions. Are you guys familiar with what that means?
Sure.
Okay, so a behavioral question is basically where, and I know this is going to sound really silly, but they want to see an example of your past behavior, and they use that to evaluate how you might handle a situation in the future. So 9 times out of 10, those questions start with the phrase, tell me about a time when. So they'll say, tell me about a time when you had a conflict. Or tell me about a time when you had multiple jobs open and you couldn't finish them all by the deadline. What did you do? And what they're looking for here is an actual story. They're looking for something that's happened to you in the past and how you articulate to them what you did and how you handled the situation. And what they take from that is not necessarily the context of it. They don't really care usually what happened, but more so, thank you, more so how did you communicate in that situation? How did you maybe work in a group in that situation? And what was the outcome? How are you going to do this again in the future? Are you going to have a positive outcome, or is it going to be a rocky situation? Those can be really difficult because you have to not only come up with a story on the fly, but you have to be able to articulate it to them in a really positive way. So even if it was, for example, if they ask you, tell me about a time when you had a conflict, or tell me about a time when you failed at something, you still want the story that you're telling them to be framed in a positive light. So you want to make sure that you're not bringing in this negative energy, you're telling them something that might make you look bad and maybe not the best fit for the job.
I think also what you learn from it. Even if you've made a mistake, what did you learn to know that you're going to correct yourself the next time?
Yeah, that's a really great point. And a lot of times they'll follow up, like, well, what did you learn from that? But if you can offer that before they even ask it, it's much better. Because now you're showing them, hey, I had this experience, but I know that this was an important learning moment for me. One of the ways that you can answer these questions every time is to use something we call STAR format. Has anyone heard of that before? So STAR format, right on like the middle or bottom third of your page there, the letters, it's an acronym. It stands for situation, task, action, and result. So the idea is that when you're telling these stories, you're giving these examples, you're hitting each of those pieces. And you don't have to say to them, this was the situation, this was the task. You can just tell the story as if you were telling it to a friend, but in the back of your mind, you're hitting those different touch points. And the purpose here is having all of the information that they might need to understand what's going on, to see what they need to evaluate, without giving them too much information. So you're not talking for 20 minutes and going off track. So the situation, that's basically the context. What was going on when this was happening? The task and action typically go together. So that's what's the problem we're trying to solve, and then what's the action that I'm taking to solve it. And then the result piece is sort of like what happened here, or what was the outcome. So when you put all of those together, typically you get a nice little short, concise story, and you're giving them an example where you're showcasing not only a problem-solving skill, but other skills that you've brought in, or critical thinking, or why you've done something. The point is that it's really hard sometimes to articulate what you're trying to say. It's much easier just to give them the example of what was actually going on. And that can be really helpful. And it doesn't have to be a behavioral question. They don't have to say, tell me about a time when. You can use examples throughout your interview. So if they say, and I know I gave this example before, but what's a strength of yours? You can tell them your strength, but then give an example of a time that you've used it, or how you built that strength, or something that will showcase concretely, hey, I have this strength, this is something I'm good at. It's like the worst hardest question ever, probably second to tell me about yourself, which is its own monster. The weakness question is tough for a couple of reasons. For one, in the interview, we've talked about this, you want to be very genuine and authentic. So you don't want to give them some sort of a standard canned response that they're going to read right through. So a lot of times people will say something like, oh, I'm a perfectionist. And that's a problem because, one, it might not come off as being genuine, but for two, if you're a perfectionist, that's just part of who you are. That's never going to change. So if that's a challenge for you, it's always going to be a challenge for you. And that brings us to the second point. So you want to make sure that whatever weakness that you're showcasing is something that you're able to work on and improve. Because honestly, at the end of the day, they don't really care what your weakness is, as long as it's not something obviously terrible. They really care, can you assess yourself and put yourself on a plan to improve it? So whenever you're answering that question, you want to include both halves. You want to tell them what the weakness is, but also how you're working on it. What are you doing to sort of get better? And a great way to even start the answer, you don't even have to repeat weakness to them. You don't have to say, like, my weakness is. You could say, something I'm working on is blah, blah, blah. So that way you're starting off right away. It might be something that is a negative, but you're starting off on a positive note. Hey, I'm working on this. This is something that I'm making better. Are you supposed to give a weakness that's related to the job, or should you choose something that's not really related so when the employer hears it, they're like, oh, that doesn't concern us, whatever. And I agree with you. Honesty is usually a really great policy to go with, because the more you can show that you're genuine and authentic, if it's something that really is a challenge for you, it's going to show up on the job anyway. So they're going to find out at some point. I agree with what you're saying. You don't want to give them something that obviously is going to be a barrier to you getting the job or being a barrier to you completing your work tasks. But at the same time, if you choose something that's completely unrelated, they might say, well, why are you telling us about this? Why do we need to know about this? So I think definitely using your judgment and reading the situation or reading the position in the company and kind of knowing how far you can stray is one thing. But picking something that, again, is maybe related to your work performance, but is something that you can improve on and show a track record of getting better.
It is an aid. It's not the presentation, you're the presentation. So that's something to keep in mind when you're using things like Prezi or PowerPoint. Whether or not, I don't necessarily think it's about which one is better. I think it's about what you're presenting. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're heavily relying on what's on the PowerPoint or the Prezi, that may be a problem.
Making sure you have backups of things, making sure that you know who is going to be there, but if someone new walks in that you don't know anything about, being able to adapt to that situation. And I think a lot of that goes back to the soft skills we've been talking about as well. So being able to, in the moment, figure out how do I communicate to this person? What is it that they're looking for? What are they looking to hear from me? Or what are they looking to evaluate? And how can I show them those types of things as well? You have to keep in mind, it's not just for them to interview you and find out if you're a good fit, it's for you to interview them and find out, okay, do I want to work with these people? Do I find the culture here to be great? So turning it into that two-way street, into that conversation is a really big strategy, and humor is a great way to start that off. LinkedIn it's a unique thing because it's one thing to just have one, it's another thing to actually use it and be active, and we were just talking about this, participate in different things. So I think there's two different halves to that conversation. It's how do you set it up first, and then how do you actually get involved and leverage it to make relationships and to use those relationships.